Okay, chapter 10 on population dynamics. Go. The key concepts of this chapter are populations are dynamic entities that vary in size over time. Delayed density dependence can cause populations to cycle. The risk of extinction increases in populations that fluctuate in size and or small. This is an interesting story of this comb jelly. I forget. I was going to look up how to pronounce. I think the M is silent. I think it would be Nimiopsis. Nimiopsis. I'm going to call it Nimiopsis. I'm terrible at species names. The comb jelly Nimiosis was introduced accidentally to the Black Sea in the 1980s, probably via ballast water on cargo ships, oil tankers, etc. They actually have giant tanks that they fill with seawater for ballast, and so these ships are designed to have a certain amount of weight in them. If they don't have that weight, then they're too buoyant and they tip over. So particularly if they don't have a lot of cargo, or that cargo's light, they'll fill these huge tanks in the bottom of the boat with seawater. And then when they get to their destination, and say they unload or they're loading cargo, so they're loading cargo, it's putting more weight in the ship. They pump this ballast water out over the side of the ship to keep the weight the same, so they ride at the same depth in the water. So what happens is if they go someplace, take on a load, they'll pump out water. They'll go someplace else, unload that cargo, pump in water, so they maintain the same weight, and they'll move someplace else, load cargo, pump out that water. And that's one way that we have a fair amount of invasive species have been spread via ballast water. And it's one of the major vectors for invasive species in marine environments, is movement via ballast water. Because depending on the length of time, it might not be days or even a week. And particularly something like this comb jelly can happily survive in the dark, just chewing away at whatever is in there. And so that's the mechanism, which is totally fair. For introduction of this comb jelly in the Black Sea. Now, Black Sea is already in trouble. It doesn't flush very well, so it doesn't get a lot of new water brought in, and so because of that and just the area part of the world it's in, but mostly that lack of circulation and that lack of flushing has resulted in eutrophication, the addition of nutrients, typically via agricultural runoff is a common one, or any sort of development, generally leads to an increase of nutrients in freshwater systems that ultimately run into marine systems. And so the Black Sea was already set up for this with the history of eutrophication and history of fish die-offs. And this comb jelly is a voracious predator of zooplankton, fish eggs, and young fish. So it's kind of funny. We have similar comb jellies here, and they're quite pretty. They're here you can see they're often luminescent, and so if you go down the docks at night, you'll see them kind of pulsating like sparkles through the water. But they run around and eat pretty much anything, and one of the crazy things about this comb jelly is it doesn't eat until it's full. When it eats and it's full, it just keeps eating and then barfs the food back up and keeps eating again. It's just a non-stop eating machine. And so one individual can produce 8,000 offspring in 13 days after its own birth. So if you have one individual, 13 days later, that creates 8,000 individuals. 13 days later, all of those 18,000 produce 8,000. You can see you get a whole bunch of these things really fast. It's pretty impressive. And so in 1989, the comb jelly populations exploded, with biomass in the Black Sea was estimated at 800 million tons. For reference, the book cited the global maximum wild-caught fishery, I believe it was around 90 million tons. So about 10 times more comb jellies just in the Black Sea compared to all of the fish caught in the ocean that year. That's in a huge number. And so this comb jelly was consuming all the zooplankton, which caused populations to crash, which caused phytoplankton to increase. And so going back to the orca whale, otter, urchin, kelp sort of dynamic, here what we have is the comb jelly consuming zooplankton, which consume phytoplankton. So we've got 3 steps in our food chain. So normally you've got zooplankton, and they're grazing down on the phytoplankton, keeping their populations low. And now the predator of zooplankton, the predator of phytoplankton, which is zooplankton, now that is being impacted by this comb jelly. So we have an increase in comb jellies, decrease in zooplankton, and increase in phytoplankton. And that's, you think, oh, that's good, like phytoplankton make oxygen, so we want them. Well, they also will die and then fall to the depths in the Black Sea, which is a low oxygen zone. And when they fall below that pycnocline, they'll decay, and bacteria will break them down, consuming oxygen, releasing carbon dioxide to further the driving of the decrease in oxygen or increasing hypoxia in the area. So we have so that increase in phytoplankton actually results in a decrease of oxygen in the subsurface waters, in the waters below the photic zone. And that low oxygen then harms commercial fishing, all the fish that would normally swim through there. Now they can't use that whole part of the Black Sea, everything. In the Black Sea, it's quite shallow. There's a shallow oxygenated zone and then a deep, low oxygen zone. So it's killing the habitat for many other fish. And then additionally, you could think about there's the anchovies here. Those are typically zooplankton eaters as well. And so they're now being outcompeted by the comb jelly, as well as the comb jelly eating anchovy eggs, larval anchovy. So it's just like really putting it to them. And there's no real predator for comb jellies, and so once they establish, they're kind of hard to get rid of. The population appears to have kind of stabilized, and so here we can look at introduction. We think was around 86. We had this huge population boom here in 88 through 90. Zooplankton biomass was increasing and then dramatically decreased. Chlorophyll, so here's peak, so these guys were probably following this zooplankton biomass increase, so that was probably driving their population increase. Then zooplankton decrease, and then chlorophyll increases thereafter. And then the anchovy landings went down associated with the increase of comb jellies. Then once comb jellies decreased, then we start to see some zooplankton rebounding, phytoplankton still relatively low, and then some anchovy rebounding. So the population is kind of stabilized. It was kind of a boom and bust situation where it was just pretty common when you have a novel organism, meaning an organism that's never been in that environment, a novel invasive. They kind of just explode and then will collapse and kind of come to some level point. Obviously, it's really hard to get rid of invasives, particularly something like a comb jelly. And they're always going to be there, and they do cause ecological harm. Here's another study looking at population change through time, and this is looking at the abundance of a beetle on tall goldenrod plants over time in New York. And this is looking at variation. Sorry, it's a 6-year study with 23 species of insects fed on goldenrod. Showed the sites had similar climatic conditions every year. Insect abundances varied from site to site. So what this is showing is that all these areas are more or less in the same spot of the world. So you would expect that they'd all be primarily forced by climate, that drought and dry years would be driving the distribution of goldenrod, which is what these beetles live on. And so they would follow that during drought years, we'd have fewer goldenrod, fewer beetles. Here, the populations are kind of doing independent things. And so even though we might think we understand the first principles, like more plants, more beetles, etc., there can be local conditions that just override that, as well as just generally what we call stochastic conditions. And when we say, oh, it's due to stochasticity, what that's really saying is it's due to a whole bunch of, I don't know, that there's variation in the world and we can't quantify it all. So there must be some stochastic forces at work when looking at the beetle populations in, I don't know, that would be Western New York or Central New York, but around New York. We can look at a couple different growth rates. The first is exponential, and so that's just, you think about bacteria. One bacteria splits into two. Next generation, those two each split into two, so you have 4. Next generation, those 4 turn into 8. Next generation, those 8 turn into 16, 32, 64, on up. And so you start with 1 or 2, and each time you go up, 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 up. That's exponential growth, just shooting up. So we can have exponential growth for a period of time, but it can't continue indefinitely. And we know this because the world is not full of one type of thing. If exponential growth was permanent, even if it was a tiny bacterium, it would cover the entire world at some point in time, right? That's at some point you can have the start being exponential, and then there'll be some sort of either leveling off or decaying. You could think of, again, like a novel invasive entering an area. They're just going to expand like crazy, but eventually either through food limitation, other density-dependent competition, predation, something will start to become limiting. But early on, we often see that exponential rate of growth. Dispersal can lead to exponential growth. Again, when a new species reaches a new area, exponential growth can occur if conditions are favorable. The species such as the cattle egret colonize new regions by long-distance events. Local populations then increase and expand by short-distance dispersal events. This is kind of a crazy one. I'm trying to get this right back here. Okay. So this jump from Africa to South America, here it says 1937. That was just when the population survey was done. It was in the late 1800s. I think it was 1877 in one article I was reading. They really don't know how. They just assume they flew over. So it seems pretty crazy that this egret just, a couple of them just caught the right winds, and all of a sudden it was, too far to go home. So they just kept going to see what would happen. Well, they wound up in South America, and then over time has spread out, including this massive, they're found in Newfoundland and Alaska at times, this massive distribution throughout South and North America, to the point where they're now the number one most abundant heron. So you think of like great blue herons, this local majestic critter. The cattle egret is now the most abundant heron in North America. Called the cattle egret because they typically like to hang out in pasture lands and things like that. So just a random event colonizing the New World, South and North America, has led to this exponential increase. And now that's driven by them being able to expand their area. If they stayed in South America, you'd see a leveling off. But as they keep expanding their area, the overall number of active nest sites in North and South America has been increasing. Now, eventually it's going to level off, right? But that first initial entrance has been increasing. And so, these are active sites within San Francisco Bay. So eventually that'll level off, and then that population will start to expand and start to disperse into other areas. Pretty interesting. I don't know if I've ever seen one up here. The map shows that they're been recently seen in Washington. I don't know if it's maybe the more coastal areas like Willapa Bay, and some of the kind of the flyover areas associated with that. Logistic growth is the number of individuals increase rapidly at first and stabilize as the population increases carrying capacity. So this is more of kind of an S-shaped curve. And carrying capacity is the maximum population that can be supported indefinitely by the environment. So there's some carrying capacity of the environment. You could think of, cattle on a rangeland. There's only so many that can be supported. If you put too many out there, they'll start to starve and die off until they reach an equilibrium with the environment. This makes a whole bunch of assumptions about the complexity of the system and then also the stability of the system. But here's an example from, this is from Tasmania. When sheep were introduced, the sheep started reproducing, going like crazy until they more or less hit a stable population of, bouncing around between about 1.2 and 2 million sheep on the island. And that's just basically a full expansion of available grazed land or grazed habitat. So there's a sharp increase as they're expanding out into new areas and recruiting in new areas, and then as those areas get fully realized, then the population begins to stabilize. So if they're the first sheep in an area, they're going to have more abundant food. They're going to have more and healthier young. They're going to survive, have more and healthier young. As food becomes limiting, you'll start to see increased die-off, typically in the winter, decreased calving rates. So instead of having 2 or 3 calves per birthing event, they might only have 1, and decreased survivorship of those calves. I guess they're called lamb with sheep, but it's sad to think about dying lambs. So population sizes can fluctuate. In some, the numbers increase or decrease erratically from an overall mean. Examples of phytoplankton in Lake Erie. And fluctuations can occur as deviations from population growth patterns. So we can try to fit exponential or logistic growth curves to our populations to help kind of understand them. This is a variation in phytoplankton abundance in Lake Erie, showing fluctuations above and below the overall mean of 2,250 cells per cubic centimeter, or cells per milliliter. And so what we'll have is blooms and then sort of die-offs and then more blooms. And so this is looking at, these are months, so January through December, January, February. So typically what we'll be having here is April, May, large blooms. All the nutrients are there from the winter. Now we have light. Nutrients get depleted generally, and then generally like a larger August, September, October bloom, generally with the remixing of nutrients from the deep waters. So that we have our fall bloom and then maybe some small winter blooms. And so the phytoplankton dynamics kind of always look like this. They're pretty sporadic because it has to deal with stability of the environment, the lake, and nutrients and light. And all of those are pretty dynamic. We can have a population outbreak, and that's when a novel organism is introduced to an area. Comb jelly is one. The other is this mountain pine beetle, which has killed millions of trees in British Columbia. It's altered the forest species composition. The death and decay of these trees is releasing carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. The next picture is that. This is a gross picture. I always kind of do and turn the page. It's not real, which is a good thing. But this is from the Natural History Museum, and it's showing cockroaches in a kitchen that represent what could be produced by a single pregnant female in just a few generations. And so if left unchecked, you can get lots of cockroaches really quickly. But here's the Lodgepole Pine, which is the one that's being killed by the outbreak of pine beetles in British Columbia. This is showing the red foliage. I think that's the foreground. I can't really see red, but the front ones look red. So this has been a big issue, and then it's also a big issue around forest fires as well, right? Now if we have all this dead wood out on the landscape, one small spark can really light the place up. And so there's been a lot of trying to figure out what to do this in relationship to other industries. Can thinning, logging, things like that help reduce the number of lodgepole pines and slow the spread of the pine beetle? Can we, after it's been killed by a pine beetle, is there a window where we can go in and log that tree to prevent it from being fuel for a wildfire and get some economic valuation out of it prior to it decaying? It's a pretty hot topic. So there's many factors that can cause population fluctuations. In the Black Sea, zooplankton abundance increased because phytoplankton increased. Zooplankton numbers then plummeted because of the, what do we call it? Nemiopsis, the comb jelly predation. So again, think about it in terms of the prior otter, urchin, kelp sort of dynamic, where no otters, lots of urchins eating lots of kelp. You introduce otters, they eat the urchins, now you have lots of kelp. Same dynamic, just different critters. Here's one about Hantavirus. So Hantavirus has been around for a long time, but there was a big outbreak in the 90s, in the early 90s of Hantavirus. And this is kind of an interesting one because this is a massive human health crisis, and then some what would a mouse, it's like a small mammal researcher, I guess is what they'd be called. They're not mouseologists, but some rodent specialists happen to have the data that kind of helped tell the story, which is there was a massive increase in the deer mice, which are the carriers of hantavirus. You catch it if you're exposed to their feces, typically, or urine. And so if you have a mouse come in and poop everywhere, and then you're cleaning it up, and you get some, you can get it that way. It's a respiratory illness, so it can be fatal. It's pretty bad stuff. So if you're going in to clean up, like my advisor had like an old family cabin in Arizona, it's pretty common practice for people who wear respirators and like full gloves when they clean up, something like that, like a cabin that's been sitting there for a couple of years and not maintained to clean out all the rat stuff, the mouse stuff. And this increase in deer mice populations was related to increased rainfall. So we had a few wet years that had increased vegetation that led to increased mouse density. So maybe a year or two lag effect. Mice reproduce pretty quickly, and then again, if there's a lot more food, they'll have a lot more young. They'll mature more quickly and have more babies as well. So you can bump up your population pretty quickly. And so this increase in population size probably led to increased transmission of hantavirus among the mice. They're more densely packed. Disease transfers more quickly, as well as just more mice. And so they're interacting with people more. They're starting to chew the vegetation down and occupy homes and other areas where they'll come into contact with people. We can also think about population in cycles. Lynx and hare, kind of like the classic example, but alternating periods of high and low abundance can occur at regular intervals. Populations of small rodents such as lemmings and voles typically peak every 3 to 5 years. So this is like telling you a story and then like telling you when it doesn't work. So there's an idea that in Greenland, the colored lemming, this cute little guy here, abundance tends to rise and fall every 4 years. The population cycle appears to be driven by predators, the most important of which is the stoat, which is a muscalid. In other regions, lemming population cycles may be driven by food supply. So the idea is you've got more lemmings. Those lemmings are feeding happy predators. They have more offspring, then you get more predators. They mow down the prey, the lemmings, until the lemmings begin to crash. Then the predator crashes. So then the lemmings can rebound, and the predator rebounds, and we kind of go through the cyclic cycle. That's true in some systems. There's other factors that can lead to population variations. There can be internal factors, and so there can be hormonal control which is based on the knowing that there's going to be a food shortage, or as resources began to wane, rather than produce a whole bunch of offspring that are going to have a low survivalship. There can be a hormonal or behavioral change to kind of preemptively switch to having 1 or 2 well cared for offspring, as opposed to 5 or 10 offspring that you're likely not going to be able to care for, because while there's a lot of you, the food, there's a high food limitation. External factors: weather, flood, supplies, food supplies, predators, and these factors can vary depending within the same species in different areas or with different species. And so it's not always the classic more prey, then more predators, less prey, less predators, more prey, more predators. It gets a lot more complex. And so we have seen this 4-year cycle driven by predators. In other studies, predator removal had very little effect on the population. So in Norwegian lemmings, this limitation is caused by food limitations. So you can have the same 4-year cycle in the absence of predators, and here it's just driven by what we'll learn to be called density dependence, meaning a whole bunch of lemmings grow up, they overgraze, there's less food resources per lemming, you have more lemming death, decreased lemmings, the lemmings that are surviving now have more food resources, they're able to survive better, be healthier, have more healthy offspring. Population increases till they eat themselves out of house and home, population declines. And so you can have that where, you would think, well, everything else is the same, right? There's like a fixed amount of grass in the field, and how come they keep just eating themselves out of house and home, crashing and doing it again? They probably adapted to things like that, where they're need to take a lot of advantage of environmental abundances in short periods. So population cycles may stop if key environmental factors change. Warmer temperatures affect snow conditions at high latitudes, making it more difficult for lemmings to feed and avoid predators. And some populations have stopped cycling every 4 years. And so if they're not able to kind of go crazy, like hog wild, when there's this massive environmental abundance, if other factors are keeping them at bay, predators that they wouldn't have normally had to interact with, but they are now due to environmental change, that's causing a behavioral shift where there's plenty of vegetation out there, but they're not able to fully capitalize on it because they're afraid of getting eaten. So that'll help potentially stabilize the population, because they're not riding those booms and busts where they just go out, feed like crazy, uninterrupted by predators, make lots of babies until they eventually run out of food, the population crashes. Now, because of the fear of predation, they're they're changing their foraging habits where they're not overexploiting the resource. And climate warming may have contributed to the collapse of vole population cycles in Europe, but vole cycles in Finland have continued. There's some other examples where the Canadian gypsy moth cycles have resulted from a specialized pathogen rather than climate change. But there's lots of ways that populations can vary. These like idealized predator-prey cyclical systems are probably in many ways the exception, not the rule. But we need to think about those dynamics of what's causing that variation. And then we'll talk about that in terms of density dependence and independence and some of those factors. That'll wrap up Chapter 10A.